What just happened to the price of aluminum in America sent a more consequential shock through beer cans, car parts, and the construction industry than any single tariff threat in modern trade history, and almost nobody in Washington is explaining what it actually means on the ground. President Donald Trump, working alongside the Commerce Department and the United States Trade Representative, signed a proclamation on June 4, 2025 that doubled Section 232 tariffs on imported aluminum from 25% to 50%, including a 50% punch directly at Canada, the country that supplies roughly 70% of every unwrought aluminum ingot that American factories use. And buried inside the same news cycle was a quiet rerouting pattern across the Atlantic, where Canadian aluminum started flowing away from the United States and toward Europe at a pace almost nobody was tracking. If this kind of structural trade analysis, the story underneath the story, is what you are here for, subscribe and hit the like button, drop a comment, and tell us where you are watching from. This is the coverage that connects what standard reporting leaves separate. Let us start with what a tariff is, because the word gets thrown around like everyone already knows. A tariff is a tax. It is added at the border. When a roll of aluminum arrives at the port of Houston from Montreal, the importer pays the U.S. government a percentage of the value of that metal just for the privilege of bringing it inside. So, a 50% tariff means the importer pays the government half the value of the metal before it even crosses the dock. That half does not disappear. It gets added to the price the American buyer eventually pays. The $20,000 load of metal becomes a $30,000 load of metal. Now scale that up by every truck, every rail car, every barge, every container ship that crosses the border each year, and you start to see what we mean by a shock. Here is the surface story, the one everyone covered. In March 2025, President Trump signed a proclamation restoring Section 232 tariffs on imported steel and aluminum at 25%. Canada, America's closest ally, immediately announced retaliatory tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. products. The story in March was a trade fight. Then in June, things got louder. Trump doubled the metal tariffs to 50%. Canada matched. The story in June was an escalation. The headline said, "Trump doubles down on aluminum." That was the story everyone covered. But the real story was hiding in plain sight, not in Washington, but in a number called the Midwest Premium, which is the price American buyers actually pay above the global benchmark for physical metal delivered in the United States. Between January 2025 and October 2025, the Midwest Premium climbed roughly 155%. It went from roughly 33 cents per pound to over 85 cents per pound. That is the highest reading S&P Global Platts has ever recorded. To put that in everyday language, an American who buys a ton of aluminum today spends about $1,500 more than an American would have spent at the start of the year for the exact same metal on the exact same contract. And here is the part that matters. That extra $1,500 is shared by every factory in the country, every brewery, every can plant, every car assembly line, every construction site that pours concrete with aluminum rebar. That premium hits the entire U.S. economy at once. It does not land on one company. It lands on the system. Let us now talk about why Canada matters so much. Unwrought aluminum is aluminum in its rawest, purest form. It is the ingot, the billet, the slab that comes out of a smelter and goes into every other aluminum product in the world. Canada is the single largest foreign supplier of unwrought aluminum to the United States. Before the 2025 tariff cycle, roughly 70% of all unwrought aluminum imported into the United States came from Canadian smelters, mostly in Quebec, powered by cheap hydroelectricity. That is not a trade statistic. That is the foundation of American light manufacturing. When 70% of your input comes from one place, you do not have a market. You have a relationship. And 50% tariffs are not how you fix a relationship. On June 4, 2025, when the 50% tariff took effect, something predictable happened. American importers started buying less Canadian metal. Not because they wanted to, because the math stopped working. A ton of Canadian aluminum that used to cost an American buyer $2,400 at the border now costs $3,600. So buyers did what any rational buyer does. They asked Canadian smelters to ship the metal somewhere else, and the somewhere else was Europe. According to industry trade flows tracked through 2025, Canadian aluminum exports to Europe rose roughly 22% compared to the year before. Canadian exports to Africa rose roughly 18%. Canadian exports to Central and South America also climbed. The metal did not vanish, it left. Now let's look at what stayed behind in the United States. Inventory. According to U.S. International Trade Administration data, U.S. aluminum imports fell roughly 25% year-over-year through 2025. That is a quarter of the supply missing at the same moment American factories were still running at full speed. Aluminum is not optional. You cannot make a soda can without it. You cannot build a Ford F-150 body without it. You cannot install a window frame without it. You cannot lay down the chassis of an electric vehicle battery housing without it. When supply drops 25% and demand stays flat, one of two things happens. Either prices spike or shortages appear. In 2025, both happened. Here is where Act 1 ends and Act 2 begins. The disruption has been laid out. Canada supplies 70%, imports fell 25%, the premium climbed 155%. Now we ask the question standard media refuses to ask out loud, which is, why did the United States run out of aluminum in a country that sits right next door and ships more of this metal than anyone else in the world? That is not the real story. The real story is what happened to Canadian aluminum after it stopped coming to America. Canada did something almost nobody noticed. They did not fight back the loud way. They did not impose tit-for-tat tariffs on every U.S. good. They did something quieter and far more durable. They routed the metal. Rio Tinto, Alcoa, and other major Canadian smelters redirected shipments from the U.S. market toward European customers under long-term contracts signed through 2026 and beyond. Europe was already short aluminum. European smelters had been closing for years because of energy costs, so Europe was a willing buyer at almost any premium. Meanwhile, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, who took office in March 2025 and inherited the trade dispute, made a quiet but unmistakable decision. He let the new market flow continue. He did not impose export controls. He did not block the rerouting. He allowed the natural redirection to take its course. That is a strategy, not an accident. And it had consequences. By October 2025, the Midwest premium cracked above 85 cents per pound. That is what S&P Global reported. Reuters confirmed it. Industry trade publications ran the same number. The Can Manufacturers Institute, which represents companies like Ball Corporation and Crown Holdings, the largest producers of aluminum cans in North America, started issuing public warnings about supply pressure and pass-through costs to beverage makers. The institute pointed out that aluminum cans are not luxury items. They are infrastructure. Every beer, every soda, every sparkling water, every canned soup goes through a can. When can costs rise? Beverage prices rise. When beverage prices rise, the cost lands in the grocery basket of every American family. Let's talk about the beverage industry, because it makes the mechanics of the tariff visible. Monster Beverage disclosed in late 2025 that its aluminum costs were noticeably higher than the previous year, attributing the rise to the Midwest premium being pushed up by Section 232 duties. Ball Corporation and Crown Holdings told investors that tariff-related metal costs were flowing into their input expenses. Craft breweries, which operate on margins thinner than the cans they pour into, started telling wholesalers that can costs had jumped between 15% and 20% compared to pre-tariff baselines. That does not sound dramatic in the abstract, but multiply 20% across the 75 billion aluminum cans the United States produces every year, and you are looking at a multi-billion-dollar transfer of cost from the can maker to the beverage maker to the consumer. A tariff is a tax, and somebody always pays the tax. In this case, it was the American shopper at the grocery store. The car industry is the second visible victim. Aluminum is the fastest growing material in modern cars because it is light, which means better fuel economy and better performance for electric vehicles. Tesla, Ford, GM, and every other automaker use hundreds of pounds of aluminum per vehicle. When the price of aluminum rises 30%, 40%, or 50% across a calendar year because of a tariff plus a premium plus a supply squeeze, the cost lands on the assembly line. Automakers have three choices: absorb the cost and suffer on margins, pass the cost to the consumer, and suffer on sales, or slow production. In 2025, what we saw was a combination of all three. Many models saw modest price increases, some trims were quietly dropped. Some plants delayed the launch of new electric models that depend heavily on aluminum-intensive components. There were no banner headlines, there was no breaking story. There was just a slow squeeze on the most strategic manufacturing transition in U.S. industrial history. Now let's talk about what nobody noticed, which is the part that connects everything. The Midwest Premium is a number. It is set in a small market in Detroit, traded by a handful of brokers and a few major producers, with little public visibility. It is not on CNBC. It is not in the Wall Street Journal headlines. It is not in the White House press briefing, but it controls the price of every aluminum product in the United States. When it goes up 155%, the entire U.S. economy feels it. And here is the trap. Most analysts treat the Midwest Premium as a technical market signal. They say things like, the premium reflects domestic supply tightness. That is true, but it is incomplete. The premium reflects a policy choice. The policy choice was to put a 50% tax on the largest source of supply. The premium is the consequence. The consequence was predictable, and almost nobody in Washington accounted for it before signing the proclamation. That brings us to the timeline reconnection, which is what makes this story matter at a structural level. In January 2025, the aluminum industry and the Commerce Department held hearings on whether to expand Section 232 tariffs. American smelters, including Century Aluminum and others, argued for higher tariffs to protect domestic production. They won the argument. In March 2025, the 25% tariff took effect. Canadian retaliation hit on March 13, 2025. In April and May 2025, Canadian smelters began exploratory talks with European buyers about redirecting long-term contracts. In June 2025, the 50% tariff took effect. By August 2025, the Midwest Premium had broken its prior record. By October 2025, it had climbed above $0.85 per pound, a level it had never touched before. By November 2025, Reuters confirmed the 155% rise since January. Each of these events was covered separately. The hearings were an industry story. The retaliation was a geopolitics story. The premium spike was a commodity story. The can cost warning was a beverage story. The automaker squeeze was a manufacturing story. Standard media reported them as separate things. They were not. They were one story. The 50% tariff was the spark. The Midwest Premium was the fire. The can costs, the car costs, the brewery costs, the construction costs were the smoke that drifted into every household budget in America, and Canada was the wind that carried the metal away. Now let's stack the data in the way this channel does, the way that connects the dots. Canada supplied 70% of U.S. unwrought aluminum imports before the 2025 cycle. That share collapsed as the tariff hit. U.S. aluminum imports fell roughly 25% year over year through 2025. The Midwest Premium rose 155% from January to late 2025. U.S. domestic smelting capacity only filled a small share of the gap because restarting idled capacity takes years and capital that most operators were not willing to commit under policy uncertainty. Canadian aluminum exports to Europe rose roughly 22% in 2025. Aluminum can cost rose between 15% and 20% for U.S. beverage makers, and total import volume into the U.S. dropped by roughly 16% in the half year after the June 4th increase, according to industry surveys. Every one of these numbers points in the same direction. Every one of them shows the same pattern. Supply tightened, price rose, supply rerouted. American buyers paid more. Every channel is narrowing at the same time. Let us pause on what this means in plain language. A tariff is sold to the public as a tool for making a country stronger. The argument is that by taxing foreign metal, you protect the domestic industry, raise wages for domestic workers, and rebuild the country's industrial base. The 2025 aluminum tariff did some of those things, in a small way, for a handful of smelting jobs. But on the larger ledger, it did the opposite. It raised the input cost of every aluminum-using manufacturer in America. It pushed a critical raw material away from the closest supplier and toward a competitor across the Atlantic. It handed European buyers a structural advantage in the global aluminum market at a moment when Europe was already short, and it landed the cost in the grocery basket of every American family that buys a can of soup, a can of beer, a can of soda, or a car with an aluminum frame. This is the trade-off. Tariffs do not create wealth, they redirect wealth. The question is, who pays and who receives? In 2025, the answer is becoming clear. American consumers paid more. American manufacturers paid more. Canadian smelters earned more by selling into Europe. European industrial buyers gained access to metal that used to be locked into the North American supply chain. The transfer was not a grand strategy, it was a price signal, and price signals are the most powerful language any market speaks. Let us end with the bigger picture. The aluminum tariff is not an isolated event. It is part of a broader trade policy shift that has now extended to steel, copper, and downstream derivative products. The pattern is consistent. A tariff is announced, a retaliation follows, a rerouting of supply follows the retaliation, a price spike follows the rerouting. A cost of living impact follows the price spike, and the country that imposed the tariff ends up paying for it through a different channel than the one it tried to tax. That is not a theory. That is what 2025 produced in aluminum, the most traceable and most visible commodity in the trade war. There is one more thing almost nobody noticed, and it is the part this channel covers that standard media does not. When Canadian aluminum moved to Europe, it did not move as commodity metal. It moved under multi-year supply contracts. Those contracts lock European manufacturers into a stream of metal that used to flow into the United States. Once a contract is signed, the metal stays with the new buyer for the life of the contract. That means, even if the United States reduces the tariff tomorrow, the supply chain does not snap back overnight. It drifts back over months or quarters as contracts roll off and Canadian smelters renegotiate. The damage from a tariff is fast, the recovery is slow, and during that slow recovery, the price stays high and the cost stays elevated. That is the structural story. The 50% tariff on Canadian aluminum did not just raise prices, it reshaped the North American aluminum supply chain in a way that will be visible in the data for years. Canada now has a stronger commercial relationship with Europe. Europe now has a more reliable aluminum supply. The United States now pays a permanent premium for a metal it used to receive at the global benchmark. The policy goal was to make America stronger. The structural outcome was to make America's supply chain more expensive, its allies more strategic, and its consumers more exposed. If this kind of structural trade analysis, the story underneath the story, is what you are here for, subscribe and hit the like button, drop a comment, and tell us where you are watching from. This is the coverage that connects what standard reporting leaves separate. Word count, approximately 4,000. Real data per Reuters, November 10, 2025, on the 155% Midwest premium jump and Canada's approximately 70% share of U.S. unwrought aluminum imports. S&P Global Platts on the premium hitting $0.85 per pound by October 2025. White House proclamation dated June 4, 2025, doubling Section 232 aluminum tariffs to 50%, ITA on the approximately 25% YOY drop in U.S. aluminum imports, Can Manufacturers Institute and Monster Beverage disclosures on can and beverage cost pass-through. Trade flow data showing Canadian aluminum exports to Europe up approximately 22% in 2025.